Good morning. Thank you. My name is Elise. Thank you to Ina Stanovic and Barbara Gentili for this opportunity and organising this event. Also to Duncan Miller for his acoustic technology cylinder and disc. What a wonderful and ear-opening workshop on mechanical sound recording and performance we had yesterday, focusing on the voice. I'm a researcher with a creative interest in sound and background in piano technology, not a singer. Although my choice of instrument, the piano, back when I was 8 years old, was however determined by a wish to sing, to accompany song. My topic for today is the piano that sings, an instrument reported to have been inspired by a request from singers at the Brussels Conservatoire for a device that would allow them to hear their voices whenever they wanted. How might we understand it as being modelled both on the voice and on the recording device for the voice? The cantacorde from cantacorde, or singing strings, producing sustained tones and judged by listeners at times to resemble the singing effects of the human voice, was a mechanical device to amplify and manipulate piano string resonance, patented by Georges Cloetens, a sound magician, organ builder and voicer, which designates the tuning of organs, in Brussels in 1931. Where Scott de Martinville modelled his phonautograph in 1857 on the human ear canal and eardrum, here is another anatomical inspiration analogous to its bodily function, not hearing but speaking, receiving as well as producing, and like the voice, not automated but a tool to be used in live performance. To make a piano sing, what has not been attempted to achieve this miracle, writes fellow musician and inventor to Cloetens in 1934, rotating bows, electromagnets, amplifying bulbs, etc. The results were hardly encouraging, not to mention the fact that proposed means made the piano unaffordable. What is most disconcerting when one hears your marvellous cantacorde is the simplicity of the invention and the means used to make the enhanced and reinforced sound of an ordinary piano vibrate and sing. Cloetens was known for the simplicity of his inventions. He left numerous patents for sound designs in keyboard instruments to modify tonal characteristics, as well as approximate or reproduce as faithfully as possible the timbres of others. An idea from 1908 that made him famous, called the Orpheal, held in the collection of the Musical Instruments Museum in Brussels, sought to reduce the circuitry required in organ manufacture and create multiple sonorities and timbres in just one column of air. It shows his interest in the space that sound takes up. The electrical engineer Mr. Marconi had succeeded in sending simultaneous messages on the same radio wave he had read in the newspaper, which made him think that since Hertzian waves and acoustic waves were basically identical, it should be possible to achieve the same results and do away with hundreds of organ pipes. Sort of like an acoustic synthesizer, the keyboard was said to realistically recreate the timbres of 15 other instruments from strings to woodwind and brass, including their characteristic attack transients. The lick of a horn player, the crunch of a bow on a string, and multiplicity of voices in one. And again, like the inspiration for it, this time in radio, focusing on live sound signals. Instruments speaking with the voice of others is not a new phenomenon, as noted by the composer and instrument inventor Hugh Davies, whose history of recorded sound, before sound recording and up to 1977, charts an incredible 2 millennia of imitative musical instruments and speaking automata, the same voices in different bodies. Treatises and literary mentions of means to store or fix, imitate and resample sounds, such as the legend of a sliding temple door in China, date unknown, that could reportedly say the words, "Please shut the door upon opening," and "Thank you" when reversed, created by a bamboo spike in its sliding grooves. Georges Cloetens' inventions, his musical instruments, are characterized by a desire for audio fidelity, accuracy of sound synthesis, the elimination of disagreeable resonances, a desire for sound in effect that is lossless. Recording technologies at the time evidently still left much to be desired. Radio programs of performances by him on his instruments indicate that he recorded a couple of phonographic discs, one of which has surfaced so far is an as yet undated 78 RPM 10-inch shellac with a commercial reference recorded by Pathé in Paris. Experimenting with new sound potentials, Cloetens clearly took an interest in other sound technologies and their workings. In building his Orpheal, he says, He solves the problem of acoustic interference in his polyphonic and multi-timbre resonator by using coloured powder and smoke techniques for graphically visualizing sound to literally observe the dynamic flows of air currents inside his machine. And as we're on the topic of capturing sound vibration to Davy's list, we might perhaps add the beautiful string oscillation inlaid on the fingerboard of the oldest guitar known to exist in the world from 1581 by Belgio Diaz in Lisbon, now in the collection of the Royal College of Music here in London. At least that's what I see when I look at this. On stringed instruments, incidentally, the length of the string that oscillates is known as its speaking length. On organs, we have the speech of a pipe. Broadly, Cloetens instruments can be grouped into those exploring string resonance, his string theories, and those exploring pipe resonance, his pipe dreams. Combining strings with fluctuations in air pressure, his cantacorde device, singing strings, brings the two fields together. And since it's not among the instruments by Cloetens in the collection of the museum in Brussels, I've been trying to piece together what the cantacorde was from contemporary accounts and the numerous patents which are filed by acoustic principle rather than named invention. These give slightly different details across different languages and countries. The sales catalogue suggests that it did indeed have something of the operatic voice, to be precise, which was its capacity for increase in power of the instrument in unexpected and advantageous proportions from quadruple pianissimo to quadruple forte. Since the radio engineer and composer Pierre Schaeffer in his 1953 essay, The Voice as Musical Material, comments that in the past, quote, "The voice must have seemed like the most melodious of sound sources. But in the modern orchestra, when it makes itself heard, one sees the sound engineers' faces become tense and their hands scrabble attentively across the controls, for in the broadcast of an opera or a cantata, the singer, and particularly the female singer, can seriously compromise the sound balance at any moment. Just one single human voice, and there is the risk that the transmitters will trip, even when they have patiently endured the mounting volume of the 80 musicians of the orchestra," end quote. Just as in an ordinary piano, the instrument's nuances and expression depended on the touch of the keys and the pedals, the interface, the control. It is this unexpected and surprising increase in amplitude that would distinguish it from, for example, the swell boxes of organs and the Venetian swells of fortepianos, which work through opening and closing. The German patent notes that in wind-operated instruments, if these louvres at the threshold of the resonance chamber were allowed to vibrate rapidly, imitations of the human voice were obtained, resulting from this strengthening and weakening in the signal. In his Orpheal, on the right, the swell mechanism underneath the two bells pictured earlier ensured similar pressure fluctuations, although unlike the explicit vox humana of the organ and the cantacorde, in the Orpheal this is to create a vibrato for bowed string sounds. And the terms tremolo, amplitude, vibrato, frequency are generally used interchangeably in these texts. Nevertheless, it seems the cantacorde is more akin to the vox humana, with tremulant acting on the air supply, not the vox humana stop that wobbles due to the audible beating and interference of detuned frequencies. As an organ builder, Cloetens was working with sound diffusion, directionality, and space. You have to have the instinct of a meteorologist to do this job, he recounts. The organ is a body inside another resonant body, the space it is in. Sound as a system. For the vocal students of the Conservatoire, it is said Mr. Cloetens built a very simple recording device for speech and singing, and it was then that he came up with the idea of applying the process to the piano. Nothing was achieved until he had the idea of trying to recapture the sound lost by this instrument. As we know, the back of the piano is closed with a cloth, so 3/4 of the sound will be lost, either against the wall in the case of an upright piano or against the floor in the case of a grand piano. Placing his recording device behind the piano, Mr. Cloetens succeeded in his experiments. All that remained was to exploit it. Recovering and using the lost sound was the inventor's goal, and he quickly replaced the backdrop with a wooden panel. The sound of the piano was recovered, but distorted. A simple tilt of the panel corrected this defect, and the result was marvellous. the piano, in spite of its sonority, obtaining a volume of sound that was strangely enlarged to the point where it became more singing and more expressive than the most perfect organ. And the marvellous thing about this innovation was that the touch of the keyboard alone controlled the intensity and variability of the sound. The piano was alive, but it had lacked one thing, the song, for example, of the violin. With the addition of an incredibly simple vibrato, the first cantacorde, the piano that sings, was born. He continues, the inventor himself explained all this to me a few days ago. Mr. Cloetens took no pride in his invention. On the contrary, he pointed out to me the simplicity of his discovery and let me judge the effect he had achieved. I heard his piano cantacorde, and I can assure you I could hardly believe my ears. Cloetens himself says, the cantacorde is a device that recovers sound from a resonance box placed behind the soundboard, and imagine that those side views are closed panels containing and directing the sound that would otherwise be lost upwards towards the radial fan. A tiny motor whose rotation is regulated by a small rheostat activates a rotating partition that causes the sound wave to vibrate in the same way as a string under the pressure of the performer's finger. There are other effects from pianist's motor triple forte, the impression that the piano is singing, the string sound being modulated by the air. And like the performance of a solo line in a string quartet, the cantacorde allows any note to vibrate with its counterparts, maintaining a diminished intensity. Again, this distinguishes it, notes the sales brochure, from the organ, where the tremolo works uniformly on all of the notes in the same rank. The same document notes that to the cantacorde can be added, but only on an upright piano, another device that allows one to obtain sonorities that recall those of the harpsichord from the 16th and 17th century, of the guitar, the cymbalum, etc. And here again, thanks to the turning partition, one can impart to these instruments an expressive vibrato which they have never had in the past. No more, might we repeat, than the piano itself, a new voice in an old body. This works, as you can see in the pictures, on an instrument by Cloetens that recently came to light in the collection of Peter Boeckert in Ghent, now in the museum in Brussels, by lowering a piece of felt with brass tips between the hammers and the strings, exactly like the much more famous Jangle Box piano at Abbey Road Studios, beloved by the Beatles. Also a piano also built in the 1930s. And on the right you can see there's an extra means for opening the lid further. So modulation of the singing or vibrato effects influenced by speed of rotation. Relating it to shutter speed, exposure time, the French patent records that a diaphragm similar to the diaphragms used in cameras could be used instead. In figure 3 at the top, the first Belgian patent relating to the design shows it positioned in front of the bell of a loudspeaker, similar to the Leslie speaker a decade later in 1941 with its rotary Doppler effect loudspeaker and amplifier to enliven the sound of the Hammond organ. And in relation to the swell boxes of the organ, the German patent notes that in wind-operated instruments operated by pressure or suction, it has already been proposed to change the nature of the tremolo by means of rotating vanes powered by the wind blowing the instrument. But this type of mechanism only reduces the original tremolo of the instrument, which remains of low amplitude and can be represented by a strongly flattened sine wave. Whereas with stringed instruments, the amplifying cone and revolving vanes can be used to produce cantabile effects, which can be presented by a sine wave of large amplitude with an instrument that generally does not produce vocal sounds. In the image here you can see the application of this windmill from the drawing in one instrument which is available for study, called the cellophone. And the windmill is actually quite large, approximately 22 centimetres in width, situated behind the top part of the instrument there, since the sound is produced underneath the keyboard, unlike in a piano where the action mechanism would be in that area. Cloetens describes it, the cellophone, as a keyboard paraphrase of a vibraphone that permits artists to sustain chords and arpeggios, but the image in the patent drawing shows the tilted panel at the back, a feature which the extant instrument lacks, instead having a gauze-like panel, so the sound is presumably not regained in the same way as the cantacorde, where it is boxed in. How all this works, remarks a listener in 1934, is through a judicious pairing of beauty and electricity. Here you can see the radial fan in action. The English patent describes that preferably the windmill would have a small friction device actuated by hand or means of a pedal to regulate the speed. A drawing bottom right of such a mechanical pulley brake acting on the motor for a performer to be able to vary the speed of rotation while playing pops up in the German patent. And where the upright piano cantacorde has, and as well as the celestophone, have only one fan, Cloetens also designs for grand pianos with 2 fans or baffles and different sound deflecting panels positioned in different ways, mirroring first the angle of the piano's lid underneath it, then bypassing the lid entirely in a larger enclosure which again, like the upright, directs the sound underneath and around it, and finally directed towards the listener and performer at the keyboard, as you can see on the right there. The 1932 US patent describes rigid inclined partitions of compressed fibre, triplex or similar non-vibratory material, one above and below the sound box, an enclosed space of increasing section, lateral partitions preventing lateral diffusion of sound. Angularly movable vanes are transversely situated, preferably at right angles to the direction of the propagation of sounds, and when 2 are provided, it is necessary these should be driven synchronously, in phase rather than out of phase. It was paramount that these sound-guiding deflectors would not be caused to vibrate themselves and thus influence the resulting production of the tone or cause parasitic resonances. So what then of the simple recording device for speech and singing? For the vocal students of the Brussels Conservatoire, by which they could hear their own voices, why a custom device if they could have purchased a wax cylinder phonograph? Were they unsatisfied with the available recording technologies? What did Cloetens as a musical instrument maker have to offer them that available recording technologies did not? It does not even feature in his patents. Was it then so simple that it did not require a patent? A tool for use in listening to oneself practice, as faithful to the original as possible, an acoustic, mechanical, instantaneous means, not by way of a wax medium, rather a sound deflecting surface, a resonance box, an echo machine. My dear Cloetens, writes his friend, you have given the piano a soul. Until now it has been a lifeless puppet. It has never had a voice. After piecing together, reassembling from disparate accounts, a starting point for an impression of Cloetens' cantacorde project, next steps will be to explore its acoustic principles in action by reperforming and making a resonance box and piano string windmill of my own, and to speculate even further what that voice may have been like. I'd like to end by listening to a track, noticing the single melodic line said to have been possible that would have been in fact a song without words, with which Cloetens is said to have opened a concert demonstrating the device. The listener reports, when at last on the cantacorde the artist began with that marvellous Russian folk song Les Yeux Noirs, which he played in imitation of the balalaikas, referring to another instrument of his, an attachment to a grand piano called the luthier. It transported me back to that Russian orchestra which on certain winter evenings had moved me to tears.
Жгуче пламенный, и манят они стороны дальние, где царит любовь, где царит покой, где страдания нет, где вражды запрет.
Thank you.